Thank you, guys. Nice to be here. My name is Ann McCormack, and I'm a farm wife from Clandonald. I do have some credentials in healthcare, but I'm an Albertan first, and we encourage our kids to identify as Albertan as well. I love prairie history and Alberta history, and I'm proud of this province. Really and truly, our success should know no bounds. I've attended several of these economic education conferences, as Danny said, and although I'm not a high profiler, I'm very happy to be able to contribute some information back. So my first slide there, actually this is Danny's title as well. I had other ideas, but that's okay. Alberta, a pharmaceutical superpower? Well, no, the short answer is no. And I should sit down now, but anyways, yeah. Slide 2, please. Yeah. Well, does the government not subsidize research and development enough? Aren't we smart enough? Don't we care enough about making things at home so Albertans aren't subject to import delays? What do we produce here? What are the experiences of drug manufacturers in Alberta? And what model might we follow so that Alberta can produce the things we need? And I'm just, in this case, medications to keep our population healthy. Well, and next slide, please. We know that there's been some difficulties lately. We know doctors who have been bullied and coerced, who have had their expertise effectively nullified by Alberta Health Services establishment and their own colleagues. Shame on them. Healthcare workers thrown aside for trying to claim their human rights. Vaccine mandates and passports, and I'm sure before long what will be life-threatening warehouse shortages for essential items like pharmaceuticals due to the supply chain disruptions. Food, fuel, and medication are at the top of the list for our healthy Alberta population, and we must have access to these things. We must produce these things at home. But as an example, focusing on drug manufacturing, last spring, Albertans heard international reports of treatment medications like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, among others, that may not only treat COVID symptoms and transmission, but may actually prevent it. And Albertans wanted to buy this drug, ivermectin, for instance, but it wasn't available in Alberta. It really wasn't. I remember directly contacting McKesson, the warehouse in Edmonton. They were flabbergasted. There was none on the shelves. There was none to order. There was none for us to sell. We couldn't buy it. Didn't matter how much money you had. There was none to bring into Alberta for the warehouse to distribute. So, okay, well, this is a problem, right? What could possibly help our situation? Well, maybe some research. Don't we do research in Alberta? Well, U of A, for one, has rented space and equipment and research. That's where I went to pharmacy school at U of A. They've rented space and equipment for research and development, and they've done space for pharmaceutical testing and device companies for decades. One company years and years ago was Hepion, Dr. Foster. He developed the breath test for H. pylori, and that would be instrumental in diagnosing stomach ulcers in a non-invasive manner. Right? It was a breath test. You'd breathe into it, and the presence of a gas that the microbe gives off would indicate H. pylori presence. And this could be indicative of an ulcer, and you get a couple of weeks of treatment on antibiotics and acid suppressors, and brilliant. Well, this is the kind of thing that Alberta has done and must continue to do. We need more of this. Last summer, the Edmonton Journal, July 24th, 2020, Lisa Johnson, reported that the Alberta government, or we citizens will, right, subsidize up to 20% of the cost of research and development for technology. And there will be an 8% grant for research and development spending. Jason Kenney also cut corporate tax rate from 10% to 8% that same month. So, okay, great, but that's just now? Are you kidding me? Maybe we are taking the page from other countries with successful pharmaceutical manufacturing. Our universities in Alberta are world-class, and we do have off-campus research facilities that investigate innovations in agriculture, physics, carbon capture, new building materials that do carbon capture. As far as your imagination can stretch is what Alberta is capable of dreaming and making. So yes, I would argue that, yeah, Albertans are smart enough, we do care enough, and belatedly perhaps our government is trying to encourage manufacturing in Alberta, hopefully for the sake of Albertans. So slide 4, please. As I research this project, I see that indeed Alberta does have a handful of companies that produce a few medications. We do veterinary supplies, some health supplements, and manufacture some devices and equipment. And that has expanded somewhat with COVID. It's been some really interesting companies that have come up. And that's great. I think if you Google Map, a screen pops up showing like 10 or 15 businesses for the purpose of medication production in Alberta. Pfizer's on there, McKesson Canada's on there too, but that's actually a warehouse to distribute to community pharmacies and hospitals. Slide number 5, please. This slide shows, this is a comment on our topic from the Conference Board of Canada in 2011. And I mean, it's got all the little bars and whatever. It's the export market share, pharmaceuticals in 2011. Canada is at this end. It's the third from the bottom. And what this slide means is Canada gets a D grade, ranks 14th out of 16 countries. Canada is well behind the leaders in Ireland and Switzerland. Those are the two tall bars. And strengthening the biotechnology sector, a driving force of pharmaceutical innovation, will help advance Canada's global pharmaceutical position. So if you recall the questions I asked at the beginning of the little talk, I believe we're on the subject of what are the experiences of drug manufacturers in Alberta. I'm speaking to Alberta rather than, live very close to Saskatchewan, but Alberta is the one that I studied. I went to the university there. This is where I live. This is where our taxes are paid. Slide 6, please. Well, probably pretty good in some cases. What are the experiences of drug manufacturers in Canada? But what about, do you guys remember this fellow? He's so interesting. His name's Brad Sorensen. He was the CEO of Providence Therapeutics. Do you remember this guy? He was developing a COVID-19 vaccine here in Calgary, just on Blackfoot Trail, just not far, southeast Calgary. His progress in testing were at the same stage as Pfizer and at the same time, and he had asked for some support to keep his Alberta-made product competitive with the American giant companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. And you can read his story. One of the references, I saw multiple, but May 1st, 2021, CTV News Digital by Stephen Dyer. Anyway, I'm sure there's two sides, there's other factors, as there always are in these stories, but he asked for a subsidy to get his discovery going, $150 million for 50 million COVID-19 mRNA vaccine doses. Now just go back, cast your memory back to that time. Do you remember the constant news stories about the race to the vaccine that was going to save us all? And I'm not trying to push the vax by any stretch, nor am I, this is just history from the news, the recent history that's affecting us still today. I'm not trying to push the vax by any stretch, but do you remember, especially the state broadcasters, adding hysteria to the race for the vaccine? We had to have it. We were all going to die otherwise. In addition, Sorensen asked that Canadian companies be included in the discussion around procuring vaccines for Canadians, not force the government to buy Canadian. He just wanted to include the Canadian companies in the discussion around vaccines. Well, they didn't. And Sorensen called the situation mind-boggling. Read that CTV article if you're the least bit interested. He's very candid in it. I'll quote him here. He says, "We are the only mRNA company in Canada, and we shared data with the federal government that says we are in the same class as Pfizer and Moderna, and we're not being engaged in the discussion," said Sorensen. "It's just not appropriate." So the economists can talk about this a little bit more than I'm able to, of course, but imagine what effect his product would have had on the stock market values of Pfizer and Moderna, and who was invested and what was going on. So Sorensen then offered to share his information and discovery with, he wasn't going anywhere with federal politics, with the federal level of government. He said, well, healthcare is under the provincial jurisdiction. He offered to share his information and discovery with any province interested, and he got no response from any premier, no health officials from any of the provinces. He says, Canada had an opportunity to add capacity worldwide to help solve this pandemic. And instead, Canada hoarded vaccines, drove up international costs of vaccines, rather than adding to that supply, said Sorensen. As a Canadian, I'm embarrassed by that, and I'm trying to do something to change it. And he goes on, he makes no bones about his feelings and can back it up about the way he was treated in Canada. So he's very, very candid in this article, and I would encourage anyone interested to read it. Anyway, this brings me to another Alberta experience that was shared via social media, Dr. William Mackus, and he's been a physician at the Cross Cancer in Edmonton. He was involved in developing radioisotopes, which is helpful in diagnosing prostate and other cancers. He has had a bitter fight with Alberta Health Services spanning years now, where he asserts that the provincial government under Notley and the federal government under Trudeau shut his diagnostic and treatment avenue at the Cross Cancer in Edmonton and moved the operation to Vancouver for purely political reasons. It's completely immoral and unethical. He has won some of his cases against AHS in court recently, and the technology was famous in about 2012, 2013, because the cyclotron used was able to make these radioisotopes without a reactor. And I'm not a nuclear physicist or nuclear medical person by any means. But I mean, if you look at some of the articles from 2012, 2013 with Dr. William Macas, it's quite enlightening. He asserts that the move from Alberta has cost patients their lives and researchers and physicians their livelihood. So these are just two examples of some negative, but really huge experience of medical management in Alberta. These occurrences are devastating to patients, but it begs the question, well, what are these politicians doing to us? And I don't think it's anything benevolent, in my opinion. And just as a side note, talking about medication development, there are several Alberta pharmacies that will compound medications. And you have to have a special license, and it's in specialized lab hoods. And this is how you get medications that aren't available for mass production, like during a product shortage or supply. You can't unload the container ship, in Vancouver, whatever. And it does require extra licensing, equipment inspections, and all that kind of stuff. But they're a great addition to making hard to find medications available to patients. I think what they do, I think there's a place in Dallas, Texas, where you can order raw materials, and then they'll compound things into capsules or specialized lotions and creams and that kind of thing. And it's expensive, but at least you can get it, right? So a few months ago, I was discussing some of these occurrences with my dear friend. And of course, this is in Alberta and during COVID, and the direction of the conversation was, well, how do we encourage Albertans to look after ourselves in terms of not being at the mercy of foreign nations for food, fuel, medications, et cetera, the essential things that we need. And he made a comment that, repeated something that a family member had disparaged the idea of Alberta manufacturing more drugs here at home because we don't really produce the raw materials. And this is absolutely correct for some medications that we buy, but many that are prescribed or synthesized in labs. Slide 7, please. Yeah, I'm the good looking one there, yeah. So a few years ago, our family visited Ireland, which was number 1 or 2 on our list of countries to emulate, right? And we did the tours thing with an amphibious tour down the River Liffey in Dublin. And I was awestruck at the corporate development in the south. Headquarters that moved there were companies like Amazon and Google. But more pertinent to our discussion, probably 200 medication and medical device manufacturers. And as I say, like on our previous slide, I searched for and found about 15 or so in Alberta. Slide 8, please. Now, our tour guide was a genuine extra from the sets of Vikings and Game of Thrones, and when they filmed in Ireland. So yeah, this is who educated me. I'll quote Alberta Health Services, but so his job interview went like this: you dress up like a Viking. You drink as much as you can, then you take a sword and you head down to the field and you fight another guy in the same state. So that's how they do things in Ireland. Anyway, as we drove down the wrong side of the River Liffey in our amphibious vehicle, I read the signs on these buildings, and they're tremendous buildings. It's Lilly, Pfizer, Abbott, on and on. And I later told my friend that Ireland has no raw materials to speak of. I think you could fit, 7 Irelands in Alberta? For medications, but that I researched for this talk and asked what they'd done and the benefits to Ireland and that the industries provided. So now, as you all know, Northern Ireland is part of Britain, but the South is a republic, and the North does have manufacturing as well. And as you can see in the next photo, the next one, please. Yeah. I mention this because of the influence of the EU. So Ireland found oil and gas offshore. And the battle has been on for years about shutting down these dirty fossil fuels, dirty fuel production. And as compensation, like in my view, and there's different articles to back it up, but I really feel that as compensation to the job and the prosperity lost in the oil and gas industry sector, off Ireland and Scotland as well, Ireland was kind of bequeathed or allowed the pharmaceutical trade. And that's my perception of this whole misery. I mean, you can look it up for yourself. And of course, the EU's influence was sort of the template for the UN one world government type of thing, as in my view as well. So when I suggest that Alberta should emulate some of the actions of Ireland, that Ireland took to attract this essential business of making medications and devices, I would definitely omit the notion of decimating our oil and gas. Anyway, Ireland's been involved in this industry since the 1960s, where they manufactured active pharmaceutical ingredients and then sent them off for finishing packaging. And now this is done in Ireland, overtaking more of the elements in the supply chain. But look at that, for this tiny little country with 4 million people, there's a pile of manufacturing companies. Next slide, please.
They have the 6th highest per capita.
Yes, indeed, right? Yeah. This is a horrible slide because it's so fuzzy, but it shows Lilly, Pfizer, Sandoz, Merck, Shire. There's a ton of Roche. I mean, these are top end guys, right? In the pharmaceutical distribution. So when we compare Alberta and Ireland, we find, of course, the land mass here is much greater, but the population is, 4 point whatever million souls are similar. We both have world-class universities. We respect the need for research and development and innovation. We'd both like to have the United States as a customer. We speak English. There's some selling points that Ireland has used to attract business. So one was their low corporate tax rate. It's 12.5%, and Kenny has just lowered ours to 8%. Proximity to Europe and America for markets. It's a safe, free-ish country to work in. In 2018, pharma brought about 2.3 billion euro to Ireland. So that's about 3.3 billion Canadian dollars. As of 2019, Canada ranked about 9th in the world. So that's up significantly from the graph showing, a few slides back there in 2011, world rankings of pharma manufacturers, and our industry worth about 30 billion. That's across Canada. That's not Alberta. And I always get these names mixed up. Canada's leading pharma company currently is Apotex. And do you remember Barry and Honey Sherman? That was them, right? I know I always say Bunny Sherman. No, it's Barry and Honey Sherman, but yeah. But what a scandal. And I don't think it's over yet. Anyway, with about $1 billion in sales, and they're headquartered in Ontario. And then what's the other generic? JAMA, I guess it's Quebec. And I don't know their sales just off the top of my head. In 2019, the whole entire life science industry produced less than $1 billion in Alberta and employed about 15,000 people. And that's from the Alberta government website. That was Alberta's contribution to the 1.25 trillion worldwide industry of pharmaceuticals and therapeutics. But here's a screenshot from the Alberta government's website just recently, slide 11, please, about who they're supporting for development and where the Alberta industry is going. And this is horrible, I know, I'll read it. We know that this is from the Alberta, this is the commercial from the Alberta government website. We know that this sector can play an even larger role in Alberta's economy. Worldwide revenues for the pharmaceutical and therapeutic sector reached 1.25 trillion in 2019 and are projected to grow to 1.5 trillion by 2023. There is so much untapped potential in this space. Funding for the Li Ka-shing Applied Virology Institute. That's why we are making the investments today that will help us tap into this potential tomorrow with a commitment of $20 million to the University of Alberta's Li Ka-shing Applied Virology Institute over the next 4 years. This funding will help Dr. Michael Houghton and his colleagues accelerate leading edge research and commercialization of pharmaceutical and vaccine treatments. Important work that will demonstrate the vision and power of Alberta's health innovation ecosystem and position Alberta as a leader on the international stage. Well, this company is based in Hong Kong. And it'll no doubt make wonderful developments and employ many people. And Dr. Houghton, he's a researcher and he's a Nobel Prize winner, someone to be really proud of in Alberta. He's at the U of A, and his contributions and credentials are the best in the world with regard to his work. And we need that, right? But I have to say to the Alberta government, didn't you clowns just chase out that Alberta company that was already here? We're supporting, I don't even know who controls Hong Kong and what's happening to Taiwan right now. This other doctor, that Brad Sorensen I was talking about that had the mRNA vaccine, he's so interesting because the reason he got interested in the mRNA research was because his son had stage 4 cancer. And I believe that was about 2014. And the last report that I saw, the boy was doing well, thanks in large part, I believe, to his own research. This man is very, very bright and willing to contribute in part of Alberta. I had emailed him just not that long ago to his company website that was, he's left Alberta, just to get an update on how things were going in his life, with his company, with his family, with his research. And I didn't hear back in time for this. Anyway, next slide, please. So this is brought to you by Doug Schweitzer, who was just sworn in as Minister of Jobs, Economy and Innovation. And look at that face, right? Don't worry, he's going to save us. He's putting $20 million into a Hong Kong company and chasing out Alberta companies. I hope Alberta further emulates some of the measures Ireland has done to secure investment by these pharma and biopharma and medical device companies, but also that we quit discouraging our own innovators. Drug companies do know that we exist, and because they regularly sponsor medical conventions. Next one, please. This is the Canadian Society of Hospital Pharmacy Convention 2015. Usually Banff, they have a nice big do down there. And there's Lilly, Pfizer, Sandoz, Johnson & Johnson, all the big names sponsoring the pharmacy convention. And that's just great. They do know that we're here. I just don't know why they're not doing some more manufacturing here. So in conclusion, I guess having fuel and food and drug security in Alberta should be a top priority. And we know that now, especially when we see today, I wrote this on October 14th, that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cargo ships surrounding the Americas unable to unload. And the more we can make and do for ourselves, the better, and then sell the rest. And we can do this in Alberta. We have the brain power, technology, space, and work environment. I think the biggest hurdle I see is the government being hostile to a domestic and expanding sector.
I think we have time for one or two questions, but I think if you gave her a standing ovation, it'd be easier to get her back when she's a senator. So why don't we give her a standing ovation for what she's told us already? Because, thank you, Ron. That was very nicely done. Yes, exactly. So,
It wasn't very nice, actually. It wasn't being nice at all.
I think it was. And so do we have any, let's take a couple of questions.
No,
Not-
yeah.
Barry.
I was just wondering, like I said, know that money actually went to Hong Kong?
No, I don't. This is proposed development. It was announced this summer, and it'll be to the U of A over the next 5 years. So like $4 million a year. Yeah. Yeah.
It's the biggest investor in us, the energy.
It was yeah. Well, I didn't know that. Yeah. Yeah.
You lost a portion of that investment, thanks to politics in Canada. probably.
Yeah.
And yet he's still contributing money to the Bay.
Yeah.
It's the funny situation.
Yeah. Well, I hope every dollar that's contributed to drugs and research, can be spent in Alberta for our drug, recruit the best in the world. I mean, if you've got the facilities, like let's, if you've got ill people, let's try and make them well. But let's not send money out of the country. That this is my caution. I'm certainly not accusing it going of, and why can't we invest in our own people too? Why are we chasing them out? And the Brad Sorensen, I hope, is an isolated an isolated instance. But then you look at Dr. Mackes. The more you look, the more you find. And darn it, like we should be supporting ourselves so that we can share what we know and what we develop with the rest of the world. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ann. Okay. Thank you.